right, good morning. We're happy to welcome you to Robert's Library and to the Elliott Coffee Talk. Our coffee talk is named after Dr. Leslie Elliott, who was our first librarian here. So it honors his contribution to Southwestern Seminary. And our first guest for the 2023 year is our Dr. Marc Brown. And many of you already know him. I hope you do. He is a graduate of Southern Seminary with 3 degrees from Southern.
Yes, technically,
3 degrees.
yes, that's true.
As well as another degree from the Weber Institute. He also started with his bachelor's in Western Kentucky, right? So he's well educated and a great scholar, a friend of the library, and we're happy to have him talk today about some of the historical foundations in the Southern Baptist Convention and music. We give it to you now.
Thank you very much. Good. Well, one of the things that all of the people who have poured into me, and many of whom are here, have taught me well, is that we should always begin with God's Word. And so I can't think of a better place to begin than Colossians 3, and I'm going to start with 15. And let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in one body, and be thankful. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in all wisdom, singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, with thankfulness in your hearts to God. And whatever you do in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. Father, pray that you would open our minds and our ears, hearing the story of some of our forebears in music and worship in Southern Baptist churches, and we pray that, like them, we would be encouraged to have our relationships with each other and with you be guided by spirits of worship, Father. Worship in spirit and in truth. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, in some research that I did from my dissertation, I came across some things that were really, really interesting that intersected with Southwestern Seminary, and kind of the foundations of things that we may take for granted now. Like, we take for granted that the seminaries you can go and study worship. We take for granted that there are a multitude of Southern Baptist colleges and universities that offer music degrees that you can receive training to then go serve in churches. But this was not always the case. And so I just want to share a little bit of that history with you all today. I'm going to start off right here with, now, did he pronounce it Isham or Isham? Anyone?
Isham.
Okay, so Isham Emmanuel Reynolds. There you go. And there are lots of pictures of him. I just happened to choose that one. In 1910, Dr. Reynolds, he was already a Moody Bible Institute graduate, and he got a reputation, became known around the country because the Home Mission Board of the Southern Baptist Convention set up a series of revivals around the nation, and he became known as one of the vocal soloists. He was one of the guys that he gave the special music before the sermons, and he became quite well known for being very good. And in 1915, after I think it was pretty recent that Dr. Scarborough had become the president and second president, he met I.E. Reynolds at the SBC convention in Houston that year, heard him sing, of course, and hired him to come and be the first music director, and that was his title, of Southwestern Seminary, and offered him the humongous annual salary of $1,800 a year. And he absolutely accepted it. And this is, whenever you hear dollar amounts from back in the day, it can be kind of humorous for us. Well, President Scarborough and the Swivets board, they considered Reynolds, quote, a thoroughly equipped gospel singer, and commissioned him individually to train leaders that would hold similar musical skills and biblical convictions. At first, there was just a 2-year program for developing gospel singers. And that's literally the way that it was titled, the way that it was viewed, and the expectations, because, you know, churches, we want churches, especially our strong churches, to have people who can get up and deliver such moving and musically excellent performances is what Dr. Reynolds had become known for. But by 1919, they didn't realize they had an actual real leader and educator. They knew they had a singer, but they had more than that. I.E. Reynolds had developed a 4-year Bachelor of Gospel Music degree, which was offered by 1919. The first graduates of that Gospel Singers Certificate graduated in 1917 or 1918, I believe, and then the following year instituted a complete 4-year bachelor's. And in case you didn't know it, Reynolds Auditorium, which is our recital hall in Cowden Hall, is named after him. And perhaps a more flattering, certainly a more mature, you can find more mature photos of him, mature being like he was older, over in Cowden Hall now. A lot of this information I have to give credit to Julie Owens as a legacy series article on our website that you can find and read up more about I.E. Reynolds. While we do want to tell you a little bit more about him, by 1921, like in 6 years, the Department of Gospel Music had grown into the School of Gospel Music with 15 faculty members and over 200 students. 6 years. By 1926, Cowden Hall was built after Dr. Reynolds received a $150,000 gift from Mrs. George E. Cowden. You can see a giant plaque commemorating that as you come in our main entrance in Cowden Hall. It is kind of interesting that now, was Cowden Hall the second building built on campus? Does anyone confirm that for me? And so as you look back in the history of the School of Church Music, the reports were that, well, everything happened in Fort Worth Hall. I mean, it was everyone's living space, everyone's teaching space, the eating space, the school space for the kids, and of course the music students are practicing. And even to other music students, that can become a little annoying when you're trying to study or do something else. And so I think that that was no small motivation to let the second building, let's move them out and give them their own space, because we want to honor that, and we really just kind of want to have it quiet where we are. And it also being built in the 20s, money was flowing pretty well at that point, and there are a lot of beautiful architectural details in Cowden Hall that you will not find in some of the other buildings on campus because of the time period in which it was built. Here's some pictures that I have to give credit to Jill Botticelli for providing, and especially this. We absolutely confirm that is now Dr. Chuck Lewis's office. And so we, at the very beginning, we see what was going on in there. And I love these railings, because even back then, it was almost impossible to hang anything on those walls. So they installed railings so you could hang things from that.
You can still see where those railings were in my office.
Wow, that's fantastic. So about the same time that this was developing on our campus was when radio was really starting to boom and become really not just a toy or an amenity, but a major facet in American life. And I.E. Reynolds and other Baptist church worship leaders became increasingly dissatisfied with the state of music and worship in Southern Baptist churches as a whole. Because in his role here, not unlike Dr. Kreider, visiting a lot of different Southern Baptist churches, seeing what's going on, trying to be a help, trying to tell them about how we can help train their people to go back and lead in the churches. But he was just taken back by the quality of what he ran into. And here's a quote that I don't know if he wrote this himself, but he certainly had a part in it. With the increased emphasis being placed on better music by radio in all our public and private schools, our young people must not find their churches either ignoring this vital subject or lagging behind the upward trend so favorably known to them during the week. And so you can see that comes from a 1939 report. We'll get to that later. So this is something that I've wondered about, and I just want to prompt you to ponder. So was the comparison with radio, were they really addressing the style of what worship was happening, or the quality of the music, or both? think sometimes our language is a little muddled in that area even now. So I want to challenge you to think about that. Then we talked about the fine financial times in the 20s. Well, that came to a hard stop in 1929 when the stock market crashed. We entered the Great Depression. But despite the dire conditions, I.E. Reynolds began requesting the SBC Sunday School Board undertake a, quote, real survey of the musical program of Southern Baptist churches. And representatives from the Sunday School Board, they rejected his request. They said the Sunday School Board had neither the time nor the money. Well, $5,000 was a lot of money in the beginning of the Great Depression. And the logistical operation of trying to survey what was then 24,500 mostly rural churches would have been a very, very significant undertaking. In fact, in 1930, the executive committee of the SBC faced a debt of several $1 million. I could not find the exact amount, but it was always referred to as in the millions and usually said several millions. And in 1930, the salaries of all Southwestern Seminary faculty and staff were cut in half. And what pay they did receive was at least partially made up from eggs and produce from local farms. And I don't know if any faculty or staff left, but I imagine that based on the conditions in our country as a whole, that was just fine, you know. 7 years later, on May the 16th, 1937, the Sunday School Board finally appointed a committee to study the conditions of church music. I.E. Reynolds expected that the completed survey would help to provide a clear perspective as to the true quality of worship in SBC churches and thereby give him and then the committee a platform upon which some positive changes could be made. Well, what kind of positive changes needed to be made? I looked so hard to try to find a photograph of this committee and I could not. This is former Dean of the School of Gospel and Church Music, Dr. Ray, and this was at least some of the faculty at the time in 1937. So this is the same time frame, but it was in fact not the Committee on Church Music, I gotta tell you that much. Oh, you see there was a beginning and ending date. Foreshadowing, okay. So the Committee on Church Music included Mr. E.A. Converse Jr., who was from Louisville, Kentucky, and was a chosen representative of Southern Seminary. Professor R. Inman Johnson, or Prof. Johnson as he was known at Southern. Then we had Professor E.O. Sellers, who was the original, he was the I.E. Reynolds at New Orleans Seminary. It wasn't called New Orleans Seminary at the time, it was called the Baptist Bible Institute. All right, then you had Professor B.B. McKinney, who was at that time the music editor of the Sunday School Board, but he was also a product of Southwestern Seminary. And then, of course, Dr. I.E. Reynolds, director of the School of Sacred Music at Southwestern. So they made a report in 1938, and they made the report to the Sunday School Board. The report was still not, they were not allowed to report to the convention at large. They reported their findings to the committee, because, you know, let us know what you find, and then we'll decide if we want to stir everybody up or not. I mean, honestly, it's probably what was going on. Okay, quote, our committee in its study and deliberations has discovered a widespread need for the promotion of higher standards of worship in our churches and recommends that this committee, the executive committee, this music committee, be asked to continue its study and report next year at the annual convention. They're like, okay, we found enough, let us continue, and next year let us share this with everyone. People didn't just drop things in Twitter back then, and all of a sudden everyone knew. In order for information to get out and be shared, it had to go through formal channels, and it had to be presented formally at the convention. In view of the fact that the Sunday School Board has rendered such valuable service in promoting the work of organization and instruction in our Sunday schools and other phases of denominational life, we recommend that it be requested to render a similar service in developing the ideals of worship, particularly as they relate to the ministry of music. Sunday School Board was great on Sunday school, and of course had grown to supporting pretty much every other aspect of life in Southern Baptist churches, particularly missions, of course. But quite honestly, it appears that worship was just assumed. It was just something that happened. We need to be about, Sunday school and missions and, of course, training preachers, but not a lot of thought had gone beyond that for worship and music. We suggest that the Sunday School Board be requested to project a survey of church music in the churches of the Southern Baptist Convention, and that it be along the following lines. They got detailed. We want to know the amount of money that churches spend annually for paid leaders, books and music, instrumentalists, organists through orchestras. How much money are churches spending toward this? And ascertain the value of church musical instruments. Like if you go to Gambrel Street Baptist, how much value is sitting there? How much money has been spent on things that are used regularly for worship? And to learn the type of music being used. What hymnals are churches using? What songbooks? What anthems are the choirs using if they have a choir? We recommend the committee seek to secure in our various educational institutions, summer assemblies, training schools, institutes, and the like, an emphasis on the importance of higher standards of worship in all of our churches. So now they've gone from preaching to meddling, as someone might say, because they're like, okay, we're getting down to it. And I, knowing the personalities from Louisville and knowing what I've learned about I.E. Reynolds, these were not people to be pushed aside. They were given, they made their crack, and then they pushed themselves through it. We believe that the Sunday School Board will render valuable service if it will provide tracts and books dealing with matters of music and public worship. We recommend that the Sunday School Board be requested to incorporate, where possible, in its various programs of worship, hymns selected from the New Baptist Hymnal by number and title. Remember, this report is 1938. In 1938, well, I'll get to that in a second. We request that the Sunday School Board, through its literature and through its bookstores, there were already Baptist bookstores in 1938, to seek to induce our churches, Sunday schools, and other organizations to use songbooks which are published by the Sunday School Board. There were songbooks that may have been published. There hadn't been a lot of music resources published by the Sunday School Board at that point. So this was a very complicated motion they were putting forward, and it was also kind of a subtle one, like, you need to do this, and by the way, if you do it, you may be opening a revenue source for yourself at the same time. There's lots of people that can benefit from this action, spiritually and in more temporal immediate needs. We endorse the revised edition of the New Baptist Hymnal, 1926, with all its improvements, and recommend it to the churches of this convention. Well, that sounds like that makes sense to us, but there's a little more to that story. The New Baptist Hymnal of 1926 was a joint project undertaken by both Northern and Southern Baptist. They used to be called Northern Baptist, but then they changed their name to American Baptist. Some people feel like it was a subtle dig at Southern Baptist churches to do that. But at this point, there had been no hymnal produced by Southern Baptist. Now, a Southern Baptist hymnal would be produced later when B.B. McKinney came out with the Broadman hymnal in 1940, but this is in 1938. We urge that our churches lay the same emphasis upon the quality and character of their music as they do upon the other departments in their work. Why may the committee recommend so strongly the use of a single source of music for congregational worship? That's what they were laying out in those recommendations. Why do you think they wanted a single source of music?
Doctrinal control, perhaps.
Well, certainly doctrinal influence. What were some of you'll hear about some of the problems that were unearthed as far as Baptist worship. We haven't had that articulated yet. But that's very, very important. Up to that point, and even through today, there were music resources from a wide variety of sources. and churches know about them because they got popular. We know that frequently orthodoxy does not always draw a crowd. So then they came back with another report in 1939. This time they got to make their report to the Southern Baptist Convention in Oklahoma City, I see. The committee report indicates progress and provides an increasing clarification of their blueprint for enhancing the worship of Southern Baptist churches. The committee urges churches to realize the necessity for higher standards of music and verse in the worship of God. The report also indicated a tension between the culture and the church in regards to musical styles used in worship. What? 1939? Are you kidding me? Gospel songs bearing musical similarity to popular country music of the day were very popular, particularly in small country churches. Here's a quote from the report. Most of the churches, however, particularly the rural churches, prefer gospel songs over the hymns for the simple reason that they have a very limited acquaintance with or an appreciation for the hymns, especially the older classic hymns. But since no one but a master musician is capable in many cases of really differentiating between gospel songs and hymns, it really does not matter much what churches prefer. What is of greatest importance, however, is that some effective movement should be launched to steer the country churches in particular away from the cheap claptrap so-called gospel songs, which in fact have little or no gospel in them, and which in many cases are loaded with heresies of the worst sort.
Oh my goodness.
I kind of think that I.E. Reynolds might have written that sentence himself. So the question is, does that criticism reflect any current concerns for worship?
No, not at all.
Just remember, y'all, what goes around comes around. Although the survey was approved and the committee commended, the pathway forward was, of course, not easy. The SBC was a denomination of mostly small and rural congregations. These congregations had embraced a structure of worship that marginalized all parts of corporate worship outside of the sermon. I mean, we know through our grandparents and great-grandparents, I remember them speaking, going to church as going to preaching. I mean, we cannot diminish the importance of preaching in the service, but to truly only relate to worship singularly through preaching only is clearly not desirable. The preferred style of worship was based on popular music and deemed musically and theologically insufficient. Again, I'm sure that doesn't sound familiar to anyone now. The worship in many, if not most, of the smaller and more rural churches were described by SBC leaders as cheap claptrap and loaded with heresies of the worst sort. These churches were, well, let's just be honest, unlikely to generate a bottom-up grassroots renewal of worship. The best avenue available was determined to be a top-down approach. Some progress. Let's come to 1941. Ooh, that one was in Birmingham. It is heartening to observe that here we have much to record in the way of progress and good ground for hope of improvement. Instead of tolerating secular-minded choristers who have professional training but little understanding of true worship, or else allowing the type of trashy songs which often sadden or anger the thoughtful worshiper, Southern Baptists are awakening to an appreciation of noble, worshipful music. When I read these, we just don't talk like this anymore. Another evidence of progress is the growing revolt against nondescript songbooks which specialize in the sort of swing tunes that find the feet and not the heart, and utilize words which are neither literary nor scriptural. Such songbooks are peddled by commercial publishers who, for profit, victimize many congregations.
Not at all familiar.
I so totally want to divert. I will share one comment by a recent Zoom speaker to our worship student colloquium, Christian recording artist and songwriter Laura Story. Some of you may be familiar with her. She's a Grammy Award winner and a Dove Award winner, and she's also a worship leader in her church in Atlanta. And she is very much familiar with commercial music as is played on Christian radio, touring concerts, and being a worship leader in a local congregation. And she talked about how there's so many churches that now are so drawn toward, they want to do music from Christian radio. And someone who knows, she's like, the music that's on Christian radio, this was not meant for congregation worship. It's just not the same thing. They were realizing this back then as well. So do these claims have any similarities to the current state of worship in Southern Baptist churches? 1941 calls for worship renewal. More quotes from the report. Does our worship fail to attract and hold our people because of fatal defects? Are the materials used too poor? Is it deficient in unity, coherence, or beauty? Are its shortcomings chiefly musical? Or is the congregation, their words, the congregational participation short? I'd say, are the shortcomings music problems, or is it that the congregation's just standing there? Is the whole order, the whole concept of worship, is it understudied? Is it not working because it's a copy of dead traditions? Or because our worship is a hodgepodge of prayers and hymns and preachments, interesting word, unrelated to each other or to life as it pulses today? These and other pertinent questions press for intelligent answers. 2 recommendations. Number 1, we recommend the SBC call upon Baptist colleges and schools and seminaries to correlate their musical instruction toward better standards of worship in churches, including better standards of worship, higher appreciation of good religious music, and better and more training of musical leaders for the churches. And that the Sunday School Board appoint a competent representative committee to create a strictly Southern Baptist hymnal that could provide our churches with congregational music suited to the needs of our people wherever they may choose to use it. Wait, that's 1941. There's still not a Baptist hymnal. B.D. McKinney, who's on the committee, just published the Broadman hymnal the year before. Wait, maybe his hymnal might work for us. And it did, until 1956, when the first Southern Baptist produced Baptist hymnal came out. The first hymnal that I used in the first church that I served, second church I served as minister of music back in the day, they still had the 1956 hymnal. I love that hymnal. That's a great, great hymnal. I like it much better than the 75, actually. Also noteworthy, the call for Baptist colleges and schools to teach music through a lens that would train them for service leading worship in the churches. It kind of demonstrates or indicates that at least some on the committee didn't think they were currently doing that. A great gap separated, and still does in some places, musical training and musical training undertaken specifically for lifting up the churches in their worship. There's been a big change in many Baptist and other church-affiliated schools, colleges, and seminaries in the way that, and we used to just say church musicians are trained, right? And many of us here are familiar with the transition that has happened over, I'll just even say the last 5 or 6 years here at Southwestern. That's happened many places, but not all places. And I know that I got a most excellent bachelor's degree music training preparation in a state university. But it was very, very different from learning how to apply that fundamental training towards helping local churches worship better, the type of education that I got later in Southern Baptist seminaries. The Church Music Committee called out SBC college, university, and schools to serve the churches, to better serve the churches that are represented in this very important way. The committee urged churches to give special attention to congregational singing, that the singing would help to reinforce the congregational's diet of preaching and teaching. So if for its own sake some people didn't latch onto this vision of helping to have elevate the quality of worship and music, and they are not always the same thing in churches, well, there may be pastors that aren't particularly motivated by that, but wait a second, if we use theologically better music, pastor, then your congregation may have those concepts from your sermons and from Bible teaching reinforced, and the discipleship level of our church increases because we're paying theological attention to the musical diet of our congregation, and we're trying to we're putting words in their mouth and in their mind and in their heart. Isn't this something that you can get behind, pastor? Well, yep, I think it is. Churches should also diversify musical styles and mediums to reach a variety of people. As a tool to forward church evangelism, the committee used for choirs and music groups for all ages of the church. So that's a sentence I did not proofread properly. So one of the concepts in those days, which is very, very fundamental for the way that many people viewed church music and worship ministries, was through the formation of a graded choir program. And it worked really, really well for a long time. And in the last 3 to 4 decades, there has been clearly a decrease in the use of choirs and larger ensembles in many churches. There are a lot of very large churches that the sole worship ministry of their church may involve 15 to 20 people, all of whom may be paid to provide excellent quality music for services that have thousands of people. But beyond that immediate need of what's on the platform, a lot of churches in the newer worship paradigm don't think as much about, oh, we've got all these people in our church. We're not only responsible for teaching them the Bible and helping them become saved, but growing in their faith and leveraging their gifts for kingdom work. What if their gifts are musical? What if we need to train up these children, these students, these adults who in our transient culture may be in our church for 5 more years and then they move across the country? Does it matter to us that we have taken part in training them that they may serve God's kingdom in another church, someplace that we'll never see or never know? Is that important to us? It was very important to this committee back then because they're looking at everything as a whole. And back then, the medium that worked best was a choir. It still may be. I'm not going to get into that today, but choirs are not archaic, and they don't have to be archaic. They do not have to be irrelevant to modern worship. The committee believed music and singing were as fundamental to Christian life as praying, reading scripture, or preaching. Skip ahead to the 1943 Southern Baptist Convention. The committee's report becomes more specific. There's that picture of Dr. Lewis's office. I had to use it again. We have always been and are still of the opinion that many of our problems in regard to worship will be solved when we have better church music. And certainly we can't have better church music until we train our people along church music lines. We urge our Baptist colleges and universities and seminaries to place in their curriculum a department of church music, and that certain definite courses be required of all ministerial students. It was very interesting for me to find out that at Southern Seminary, for example, up through the 20s, every pastoral student, Southern didn't have degrees or formal training. They didn't have degree programs in church music and worship until 1944, far behind Southwestern. But up through the 20s, every student had to take hymnology. Every student had to take a class where pastors were taught how to functionally lead congregational singing. And every student had to be in a choir for 2 semesters that sang in chapel. Is it better to have everybody have to do that and no specialized training, or to have a small minority of the students highly trained and the vast majority to have, well, I think here we have one class that everyone takes now in biblical theology of worship. So that's something else I've just thought about, and I would encourage you all to think about it too. Our small town and rural churches are at the mercy of a cheap, non-worshipful type of music promoted principally by those who care nothing for the welfare of the church and people, just so they're able to gain something in a material way. So in 1943, they're like, wait a second, just because we got a Baptist hymnal doesn't mean that there aren't still companies and individuals out there that are producing popular religious music and selling it for their own financial gain upon churches, and they're really not thinking about curating their music at all for theological or biblical purposes. We feel that Southern Baptists are justified in asking that a considerable amount of the profits received from the sale of songbooks and other music be expended in a worthy church music education program. They're now talking denomination-wide, like truly denominationally wide. Therefore, realizing the dire need and the Macedonian call. Some of you get that. It's a lyric in a classic hymn, and it also is coming out of Paul's letters. A better church music program for Southern Baptist. We recommend that the Sunday School Board be instructed to increase the personnel dedicated to church music sufficiently to prepare and set going a constructive educational program of church music among Southern Baptists. So in the following year, the committee was awarded for their fine work by being disbanded. But that's okay, because in their place, we got the church music department of the Sunday School Board and of the Southern Baptist Convention. And I think technically some variation of that may still exist, but that's another story for another presentation. So this, anyone know what that picture is? I'll get out of the way. It's an aerial photo of some place that I spent a lot of time as a child and as a teenager, and even as a young adult, taking other teenagers. It's Ridgecrest. For those younger people that came along at a different time in a different place, Southern Baptist Convention had 2 National Assembly locations, Glorieta in New Mexico in those mountains, and Ridgecrest, North Carolina in those mountains. And they were places that churches came for retreats, for camps, evangelism, for training up, national training opportunities. Ridgecrest Music Week came out of this, and it existed for decades until not that long ago. An annual music emphasis week at Ridgecrest was to be created. Like I said, it was. Some other impacts from the committee. Well, to a greater extent, I think, churches began to understand the need to raise musical and theological standards within their corporate worship. That did happen. SBC pastors and churches realized the great need for having musically and theologically trained worship leaders. That did train. Oh, a typo. Sorry about that, y'all. Pastors and churches sent students to Southern Baptist colleges and seminaries and trusted us to train young people as worship leaders to serve the churches. And much of what Southern Baptists have benefited from in the way of music and worship for most of the 20th century can be traced to the efforts of a handful of people like I.E. Reynolds. So again, not just here, but the ministry was expanded. God gave him a few talents. He invested it for the kingdom, and God gave him more, and he did more with it. So currently there's still churches struggling to find worship leaders who have strong training in biblical theology of worship. The movement of the last few decades toward modern worship, and many worship leaders Churches have sought worship leaders who look and sound a way that fits what they want. But many of those churches have discovered, those pastors and churches have discovered over time that having musically talented but theologically shallow people leading their worship is ultimately not in their best interest. Well, there are churches that are still struggling to choose congregational songs that have biblical and theological fidelity. There are still churches that, they are struggling to lead songs in keys that are singable for the majority of the congregation because popular musical idioms and popular music songs and popular music keys from solo artists are just being cut and pasted into worship rather than thinking about the people in the seats in the pews participating. They're also struggling to disciple and musically train members of their congregation so that those members leverage their gifts for God's glory and the encouragement of the church. Give an example here. This is a friend of mine who's may later on look at the YouTube of this. That's Bubba. And Bubba and I were in seminary together. Bubba's from Georgia. And Bubba is the state worship consultant for Kentucky Baptists. And Bubba told me that every week over 400 Baptist churches in Kentucky have no one to in person stand and help lead musical part of worship, either singing or playing an instrument. No one. I'm like, Bubba, what do they do? He said they push play on the computer and they play YouTube lyric videos. Where do those YouTube lyric videos come from? The majority of them are produced by businesses and not by groups that are particularly concerned with congregational worship. Speaking with Tom Tillman, who is Texas Baptist, correlating person here, he says that the percentages in Texas are pretty identical to those in Kentucky. Kentucky has only about 4 or 5 million people, and there's almost 10% of those churches that have no one. So I hear we have 30 million people in Texas now, so that means 3,000 churches? I don't know, 300? We need pastors and churches to once again prioritize the encouraging of musically talented young people to follow God's call and be trained for worship ministry in places like our School of Church Music and Worship. I was just talking with Dr. Lewis and Dr. Kreider like 30 minutes ago, 45 minutes ago. And if all Southern Baptist colleges and universities and all the seminaries that have degrees and programs to train worship leaders, if we were graduating 300 graduates every year, we would not be able to meet the need. We need pastors and churches and denominational leaders to be burdened with encouraging young people to come and get training to serve the churches in worship, just like we do for pastoring or for missions. That's the end. I can tell I ran out of space there. So, questions or comments from anybody?
I have a question. Could
Yes.
they take some of the people who are being trained in these seminaries to be able to go out on the weekends? I mean, I know like in Texas you couldn't go to all of the churches, but could they start taking some of those people to go to these smaller?
Take our students?
Yes, even though they're still being trained.
Oh, sure.
They know more than
No, and
people not being there.
Yep.
I don't know. That's just a thought.
And in
Maybe they
fact,
are.
I believe pretty much all of our students serve someplace every week in the Metroplex, or at least no more than probably an hour away. I mean, we're doing that. We're already doing that. And we get calls, I say we, they usually come to Joe first, and then Joe sends some to me and some to Chuck and some to others. The need, even in Texas, the need, and churches that 10 years ago when they had their last worship pastor search had 300 resumes, they'll do it now and they'll have 20, and the quality is not what it's not the people that the church wants. We've gone through a period of 20, 30, 40 years that people thought it wasn't necessary to theologically and methodologically train worship leaders for our churches the way that we had believed for another period of time, and it's coming back, but we have a deficit that will probably not be made up in my lifetime. But I think we are trending in a good way. But I mean, our enrollment keeps coming up every semester in the School of Church Music and Worship. But overall, again, I think this does have to come from churches and pastors, because we respond to what they're asking for.
Yeah.
Right? Students, what are you thinking about when you heard all this stuff about things that happened nearly 100 years ago? How does it feel to think that the same things we're concerned about now they were concerned about then, and that maybe to some degree they achieved it and then it was lost? I mean, to some degree, that's the story I just gave, right?
What feels like we're looking in a mirror about the same things we face today. I guess a question that comes to mind is, how does the SBC expect to revive corporate worship and bring back ministers if they're not willing to pay the set pastors a suitable salary to put a roof over their heads?
Well, that is certainly an important issue in some places, but it's not the thing that we, I think, need to be called to deal with. I think that God is calling us, as He's calling other people to be, to seek Him, so that we are able to spiritually discern His call in our lives, and that we're willing to serve Him no matter what. So what does that mean? What would that look like for worship, for example? I think that the trends that I have seen and heard other people that know about these things talk about is that when I was your age, my expectations were that I needed to get an undergraduate in music from a good music school. I needed to go to seminary and get my master's from seminary, and then I needed to be ordained, and at that point I would be fit to serve somewhere as a full-time minister of music, and that I would do that the rest of my life till retirement. Well, God's call in my life has not ended up exactly that way, but I also see that for your generation, there are likely to be fewer, even though the need is so great, that there will probably be fewer full-time worship positions than there have been over the last 50 years. What does that mean? The need is still great, but it's more likely that along with the training, that we have the expectation that leading worship is going to be the main calling in my life, but I may not be spending 9 to 5 in a church office doing that. I may be spending all my nights doing that with rehearsals and planning and my weekends. Hey, pretty much what we do all the time anyway. But I think those expectations are different. The Southern Baptist Convention is not a denomination per se, as say Methodist or Presbyterian or Episcopalian. We are more of a like-minded collection of churches that voluntarily cooperate, and our leadership is meant to help guide us and to steward our collaborative efforts. But I have never had a paycheck to come from the Sunday school board of the Southern Baptist Convention. Even here, that's not where it comes from. So there's not someone at the top that would determine a salary for anyone. We have to be right with God in our calling, and we have to trust God for the rest, I think. AJ?
So we kind of saw how, back then, the concerns about, popular music coming into the church, and obviously we see that now. Would you say that since then to now, has that kind of been, coming back in cycles, or is it, constant throughout the years?
I think different people may have different opinions on that. The influence of popular music in congregational worship has never gone away. but I think that the people that I hang out with have been way more concerned about it in the last 15 to 20 years. That could just be where I am, or it could be that in general churches are realizing that there's a difference. One thing that I think is interesting to point out, and I think that I think there were a few see the whole thing of contemporary Christian music, that was super big when I was a teenager and a young adult, the 80s and 90s. But and you get into the 2000s, contemporary Christian music, just for listening to, for enjoying as a medium and a style, it really kind of went away because people like Third Day and Michael W. Smith and some other people were doing concerts in churches, and God laid upon their hearts to do music that would be more oriented toward worship, and they produced a worship album. Those things, the sales on those shot through the roof. And so the music industry people that owned the Christian artists, oh, that's going to make us more money. We need you to do worship albums. To the point that there's really very little Christian music that is just simply presentational for listening and stuff like that. It's all at least named worship in some way or another. But when you listen to Christian radio, it's clearly still a vast majority of what you hear on Christian radio. And by radio, I'm including streaming services, because streaming services is in effect radio. The majority of the music on those platforms are still presentational, and they may be suited for presenting in worship, but we know the trappings and how difficult a proposition it is to have that be the mainstay of your congregational worship, because people just frankly can't hang with it. They can't sing it because it's not meant for mass consumption and participation the way that true congregational music is.
Do you think the Gettys and what they're trying to do with the scene has kind of helped push the pendulum back from all that
Absolutely.
to moving forward? I feel that they
Absolutely.
are doing a great job of that.
The Gettys are on the tip of the spear as far as that goes. Now, there are a lot of churches that still push back against that. And I could talk about sources of music that is popular in churches now, but you brought up the Gettys. The Gettys are probably the most recognizable, most notable force for good in this area, showing that you can have music that truly sounds and feels modern, but also carries with it all of the qualitative aspects of congregational hymnody. And there are a lot more people writing hymns because of that. So yeah, we're very grateful.
Is that where people say it's not worship music?
What is not worship music?
So like the City Alive and Getty stuff,
Hmm.
they say, well, I don't think of that as worship music.
What do they think of it as?
And that's what it's like almost like this devotional, prayerful, but they don't think that they can worship to it because it's too much to comprehend. And so they
Because the words are too much to comprehend.
So they almost need like this chanting rhythmic to get into that state instead of to be pondering like their mind and heart engaging. They don't call it worship.
Well, for sure, there is a great diversity of worshiping traditions. And I will use that terminology rather than denominations, because within Southern Baptist churches, you have churches that you go to their worship and it's extremely charismatic. And you go to other Southern Baptist churches and it's extremely reformed. And you've got everything in between. And yes, hymns as a rule have a lot of care to the text. But I think that secular popular music has, there's a lot of it has been caring and cares a lot about text. Now there's a lot of other popular music that cares nothing about the text, and it's all about sounds and rhythm and things like that. I think there's always going to be people that just want what they want, and there are other people that are going to be looking for tools for discipleship. And again, the more trained leaders we have influencing worship choices in churches, I think the stronger Christians we will be able to produce through preaching and discipleship, and through worship, because worship includes preaching and discipleship.